So, hi everyone. I'm Jess Fiorillo. I'm the Executive Director of Harvard Education Press, and I am so pleased to welcome you to our webinar today on education and the Supreme Court student loan forgiveness. With this ruling from the Supreme Court on student loan forgiveness due sometime this month, we thought this was a good time to discuss the upcoming decision on this case and the implications it has on the future of education. So we have a fabulous group of panelists here assembled and ready to go. Are we ready for introductions? Jaspal, can you do our slides for us? Thank you. Okay, we have Nick Hillman, who is a professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he directs the Student Success Through Applied Research Lab. He's the co-editor of Civil Rights and Federal Higher Education. Our next panelist is Martha Kanter. Martha is Senior Fellow at our Institute. Employment and she is the author of The Path to Free College in Pursuit of Access, Equity, and Prosperity. Are we having technical difficulties or are we okay? Am I coming through all right? I just got a note that it might be a little glitchy. We're doing all right? Okay, if we need to change anything up, let me know. But before we launch into our discussion, we thought it might be helpful to provide everyone with a very brief overview of the case that the court is considering, because it's not intuitively obvious without a little bit of background research. So in August of 2022, President Biden announced a student debt relief plan that would wipe away or reduce the loans of about 43 million people who borrowed money to fund their educations. The justification for this plan was the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act was enacted in 2003 in response to 9/11 to alleviate the hardships that student loan recipients suffer when there are national emergencies. So although COVID is no longer officially a national emergency as of last month, it was when the Biden administration proposed the program. And the administration argues that repercussions from that national emergency are still being felt. So the student debt relief plan proposes providing relief in the amount of either $10,000 or $20,000 per student based on the small amount of loan forgiveness because he doesn't hold a Pell Grant. So the Supreme Court is deciding two things: whether or not states and borrowers have the right to sue over the plan in the first place, which requires them to show that they are harmed by the plan, and does the HEROES Act give the administration the power to enact the HEROES Act for this purpose? Regardless of the overall outcome, what's happening now is that this case is shining a spotlight on the cost of higher education in this country and raising questions about how we need to address this as a society. And that's really what we want to talk about here, because none of us are legal scholars, but we're all deeply interested in the issues that it creates for education. And I'm going to turn this over to Nick right now, and he'll tell us briefly about how we got to this point of requiring a Supreme Court decision. So Nick, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jess. It broke up a couple times in your intro, so there might be some things we can revisit in the next hour.
Okay.
But thank you for setting us up so well. I'll give a little bit of background, not specifically on the Biden administration's cancellation proposal, but go back even further of how did we get here? Why do we have student loan debt in the first place? And I'll try to do that in 68 seconds. So I think one of the major reasons why students borrow to pay for college is because college is expensive. Those expenses are not just tuition, which has pretty much doubled over the last several decades, but tuition's actually been holding pretty steady over the last several years nationwide. It's the non-tuition expenses, the room and the board, the transportation, so forth, that really adds up. And that's what students oftentimes borrow to cover. And the non-tuition expenses are rising even faster than tuition. So we have an expensive higher education system that has economic returns to it. It's still, the value proposition is still there by and large for students, but it is still expensive, and loans help pay for it. But it's happening at a time when median family incomes are shrinking, and we have enormous and stagnant racial wealth gaps in America. It's about 7-to-1 is the ratio of Black families' income and wealth compared to white families in America. White families tend to have 7 times greater wealth, and that kind of inequality affects all parts of life, especially how to pay for college. And so college isn't just expensive because of tuition, it's also expensive because of family incomes and inequalities that are deeply, deeply rooted in our social problems in America. And so our student loan system is a reflection of that in many senses. But also, the federal government has expanded the loan programs over the several years. And so I want to give a brief history of some of that background of these loan programs. And I think then we can transition right into more of today's current events around debt cancellation. Federal student loans have been around since at least 1958. And interestingly, there was a provision in the National Defense Education Act that had the first federal loan program that would cancel loans for full-time teachers. And so cancellation has always been part of the loan system. Certainly, it's taken different flavors over the years. But we should know that. And we should know that in 1965, the Higher Education Act created what is today the sort of old loan program. And in 1990s, we have now more congressional action that created more of the new loan program. In 2010, we had a major change in the old and new loan programs where, if you can already tell it's complicated, it certainly is. But what we call the direct loan program is the modern program that we are discussing today, the program that the debt cancellation affects directly, and it's the program that most students, when they borrow loans, participate in. The direct loan program is money that comes directly from the federal government to the student. But when a student repays it, the student repays it through what's called a loan servicer. So that might come up in the conversation today, but hopefully one of the goals of this conversation is to give some history, give some context of the educational issues at hand, and also to get familiar with some of the terminology and the stakeholders involved in the cancellation debate. The last thing I'll end it on, and maybe can help start up the next part of the conversation, is part of the reason of the debt cancellation debate we have today is because of politics. This is not to be understated. The role of politics, both in promoting cancellation or stopping cancellation, is a major issue that we'll be excited to discuss as well today. Jess, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, I'm going to keep switching my camera on and off. Hopefully that'll help with the technical issues. Sorry about that. But thank you for that overview. That's terrific. And I think where we want to go next is just a discussion around what you think the most important things are for the Supreme Court to be thinking about as they address the questions before them. What are the most, in your minds, what are the most important things for them to consider? And Martha, will you kick us off on that?
Sure. I do recommend everyone go to the Supreme Court website on this case, because I read the briefs from the plaintiffs and respondents, and it's very complicated, much more complicated than any of us are going to talk about. And again, you know, as Jessica said, we aren't attorneys. But in terms of the most important considerations from what I saw, in the big picture, is COVID-19 and its aftermath considered an emergency? Under the HEROES Act, you know, it gives the Secretary of Education the authority to act in times of national emergency. And so the Secretary, you know, and the Biden administration are saying that COVID and its aftermath are essentially constitute an emergency. So that was the first point I thought of. The second one had to do with the actual students themselves. Were they actually harmed, or could they be harmed by this, the debt forgiveness plan? And what they're saying is that they didn't have access to the rulemaking process, which takes, you know, in terms of an accelerated 6 months, generally a year to go through that. And, you know, the secretary is saying he was exempt from the rulemaking process because it is a national emergency. And so, you know, it's a question that the Supreme Court needs to answer. You know, were the students harmed? Did they, you know, not get the $10,000? One didn't have a Pell Grant. You know, there are two different considerations, two different students, Taylor and Brown. And then the last thing I thought of was, you know, whether the scope, and this may be too technical, but, you know, the Administrative Procedures Act tells the government that they should enact rulemaking when they need to do so to change the rules. However, does the secretary have the authority provided in the HEROES Act to waive that particular rulemaking, as I said before? So those are a couple of considerations that I thought about that the Supreme Court is going to address either way, but whether those are the highest priorities, it remains to be seen.
Your thoughts about important things that the Supreme Court should be thinking about in their ruling?
I'm sorry, Jess, were you asking Nick and me?
Were there other things that you all think that are really important for the Supreme Court to have in their minds as they're deciding this case?
Well, I am far from an expert on the Supreme Court, but I do share a lot of concern that a lot of people have that the Supreme Court is being less driven by precedent and by legal arguments these days than at least the voting majority, than it is about by some, you know, political agenda. The Supreme Court has really reached a low point in terms of public trust and has overturned a number of really key precedents. I guess the most recent one is the Clean Water Act ruling from a couple of weeks ago, which really calls into question a lot of executive authority. And I mean, I might be pleasantly surprised, but I will be surprised if they uphold this instance of executive authority.
I would build on that one, Michelle. Just if we have a little bit of more time to weigh in on this one, to build on Michelle's point, something I learned through following this case, and again, I'm not a legal scholar, but something I learned that is just so interesting and builds right on what Michelle was saying is there's this doctrine that the court evidently has used over time called the Chevron principle or the Chevron doctrine. And my understanding is that it typically gives deference to federal agencies, especially when it comes to ambiguous authority or emergency situations. And so over time, my understanding is that there's been a lot of deference, I guess is the word, to these federal agencies. For example, the U.S. Department of Education and the Secretary of Education are the experts on knowing how to handle education issues in the United States. And so they have a channel to use their expertise. And that's sort of the one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is this new concept that I understand is called the major questions doctrine. And it's maybe not as established, but it's something that my understanding is that the Supreme Court is really trying to put some parameters around major questions that have political significance and economic significance, vague terms that are sort of out of bounds when it comes to authority of these executive agencies. And so I'm really interested in this enough to be dangerous in saying something about it, but these terms I think are helpful. Major questions doctrine and Chevron doctrine or principle are just interesting to follow up on if you're curious about this stuff.
Where does the student fall in all of this? So these are questions that are the Supreme Court has to respond to that are very procedural, very legal, but am I alone in feeling like the interest of students in general are sort of not necessarily front and center in this case?
I don't think you're alone in thinking that, but I'd be surprised if that's I mean, apart from the part of the case that focuses on the two students who brought their own particular interests to challenge the law, it doesn't seem like the court is set up to weigh in on this question of whether lots and lots of different parts of society got large amounts of COVID-related relief. And do students deserve some of that too? I would say yes, they do, but that doesn't seem to be the question in front of the court.
Do you think that's in the back of their minds as they're making these decisions, or do they really have to stick to the letter of the law? Like, how much can they truly consider the needs of students in higher education in this case? Their decision will have these huge implications for students in higher ed, and it just seems like there's such a disconnect.
I think there is disconnect, but I think they will stick to the actual two concerns: the scope of the secretary's authority and the two students' claims that they should have had a rulemaking and that they are harmed by this process.
Yeah. Well, maybe that takes us to the next question, which is this decision, whichever way it goes, is going to have implications either way, whether the Supreme Court rules in favor of supporting student debt or if they rule against student debt relief. What are your expectations either way? What do you think the ripple effect will be in higher education and the way we think about this issue? Nick, do you want to take a stab at starting us off?
Sure, I'll try. One thing that has been really interesting to me is just the politics of all of this. And it's really been polarizing. Even within the Democratic Party, there's been a lot of disagreement on whether cancellation is regressive or whether it's progressive and whether it's enough. And there's a lot of internal debate within the Democrats that I see. I think that regardless of this outcome, it's going to be unresolved. And I think this might become a sort of litmus test for Democrats of how far left are they. So I think regardless of whether cancellation goes through or whether it doesn't, I think there's still that unresolved kind of tension in the political party.
I think there's another really important point about this, which is often neglected in conversations about it, and we'll go on to talk more about this, I think, in subsequent questions. But this debt relief proposal of the Biden administration, which I like quite a lot, it threaded the needle between being modest, but also having more generous forgiveness terms for lower income students who'd received Pell Grants. It's disliked by some on the left, it's disliked by some on the right, but it's a tricky balancing act. But it's not a fix for the problem of student loan debt or the problem of college costs. It's a one-time partial reset for some students. It doesn't in any sense get to the underlying causes of college unaffordability. And it's also the whole student loan debt problem is something that has taken decades to accumulate. And Nick suggested really how far back this conversation goes. So there really are no easy short-term solutions to it. And so I think, we've got to be careful to kind of put this decision in context. Even if it were to occur, it would certainly be helpful to many, many people. It would be helpful to the economy. I want to add one thing. It's coming at the same time, roughly the same time as the end to the pause of the student loan debt repayments, which have been on hold for 3 months. So, student loan debt relief would be lovely to kind of counterbalance the restart of those payments. But it's not a solution in any sense to the problem that we have on our hands.
And I just add that with a positive decision, it's going to reduce the defaults and delinquencies. So I think that's critical, and they're going to rise if they negatively decide that the court affirms the case of the plaintiffs. So, going forward, there are going to be millions and millions of students that I think are going to be burdened with additional hardships, as Nick said, the full cost of college, dropping out, in the first place because college costs are so high, even though they've been stabilized, the full cost is high, and the dropout rates are predominantly due to that. There are many other reasons, but that is a huge reason. And, especially piling on students that got a poor education, that, those hardships are even going to be further a burden for the students. And just in the big picture, 43 million, I'm not sure we said that, borrowers would get some kind of a relief, but somewhere between 14 and 20 million students would have full debt cancellation. So given the fact that, delinquencies and defaults would be lowered, then the government will save money from that, obviously. And so would the states.
Some of our viewers have brought up the fact that student loans can't be dismissed in bankruptcy. So this is not an issue that's going to go away for the students in any way, shape, or form. I think it's important to note that. But I'm also, $10,000 to $20,000 may not seem like a huge amount of money to some of us who are lucky enough for that to be true. But for many of the students who've received these grants, that is a make or break amount for them. I mean, the impact on a segment of the population who is receiving these loans, it's a huge difference. Can you talk about that a little bit, about demographics and the types of students who benefit most from these loans?
I could jump in, Martha and Michelle. Is that all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I was just looking at this earlier in my notes, getting ready, and it's always good to just refresh on the data and just see what's the newest data say. And the median, so the person right in the middle of the distribution, the median student loan debt in America, and this is Urban Institute connected to some credit panel data, it's $20,000. And so when you look at federal data sets, 53% of borrowers have less than $20,000. So you're seeing the same thing across the board. So the majority of borrowers hold relatively small debt. About 7% of borrowers have more than $100,000. We hear about the $100,000 in debt maybe in the media, but that's only about 7% of borrowers, but it accounts for about 40% of the loans. So you have a two-tailed distribution. You have a whole bunch of people with relatively small debts. I would say that even 10 or 20,000 is pretty significant. And then on the other hand, you have a pretty small share of students who oftentimes went to graduate school who have huge debts. And so, yes, there could be problems all across the board. And I don't think I'm in a position to say whose trauma is the worst, but I would absolutely say that the borrowers with debt but no degree that Martha was describing are the ones who are unequivocally burdened the most by student loan debt and struggling the most, especially when repayment begins.
And I think it's probably worth mentioning and reminding folks that the Biden debt relief plan had an income ceiling. So you often hear, why are we forgiving rich people's student loan debt? We're not. The income ceiling, I believe, is $125,000. $250,000 for an individual and $250,000 for a married couple. So some of that very high end, high level of debt is for people who are in graduate school and are going on to, really quite remunerative careers. And then I agree with Martha. There are students out there saddled with student loan debt who never got usable degrees, and that is not solely or even mainly their fault. So we have a very predatory, in some parts of it, higher education system that is eager to give people loans and somewhat less eager to give them quality degrees and credentials.
I don't want to put anyone on the spot in case we don't know this, but do we have any sense of the proportion of loan recipients that are attending community colleges versus four-year colleges? Has the loan program impacted one community more than another?
I do know that about 58% of loans are dispersed to private nonprofit and private for-profit colleges, even though those institutions enroll maybe 25% of the total student body. They account for the majority of loans that are dispersed. Now, within the public sector, I'm not sure how that breakdown goes between public four-year and community colleges, but my hunch is that it wouldn't be the majority, but I don't know that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, community college in most states is still quite reasonable. And the data that Nick just shared, it's because those schools are quite expensive and there's more borrowing going on with them. So, yeah.
So if we have to, if we are not allowed to move forward with the debt relief, the loan relief, what is the process of repayment of loans? Like that whole process of getting that going again seems like that would be so much work and effort. That would cost more than just forgiving the loans.
Do you mean the restart of student loans? Yeah, I mean, I think those are really separate issues. That the restart is going to happen. The just signed debt ceiling deal took away any leeway the president might have had to extend that pause further. So it's going to start. Right. I worry mainly about, I worry a lot about it. And in this case, it's not so much the amount of loans, but more the procedural complexity of figuring out where your loans sit and who you're supposed to be paying. During the 3-year pause, we've had a bunch of students who graduated with debt who have never repaid loans. And so they have to figure out how to do that. We've had loan servicing companies close, merge. We've had loans move from one place to another. And so restarting that system is going to be really a challenge. But I think it's a separate challenge than the debt relief question. Although if the debt relief is not upheld, it's going to create a pretty painful double whammy for students who could have benefited from the debt relief.
And I just add two data points that 26 million students already applied and 16 million have already been approved. So it's going to be a major upheaval if the court rules that, the plaintiffs and the secretary's authority was overly broad.
And that was like in a month they applied because they opened the application for debt relief in October and then they made the administration stop it in November. So there was obviously huge appetite for this. And from everything that I hear, I paid my student loans off a while ago, but everything I heard, the process was quite simple to apply for the student loan debt relief.
And that's not the only, the only arrow in the quiver or whatever. It's not the only strategy the Biden administration is using. They've really, I think, done a good job of doing some sort of less glamorous inside the department bureaucratic fixes, including some negotiated rulemaking efforts that is really in the weeds, but really important for just sort of the health of the overall policy environment. Some specific examples, though, the public service loan forgiveness, temporary waiver, they've really improved the process of getting those benefits to borrowers. And like Michelle just mentioned, I benefited from that. In full disclosure, I benefited from the public service loan forgiveness temporary waiver program, and the $70,000 in student loan debt that I had as a first generation college student, Pell Grant recipient in undergrad and pursued a doctorate, a good share of that was forgiven after, a long period of time of payment. So I've seen how it works on a very personal level, but they've also improved borrower defense claims. This is where students were defrauded by their college. They've done a lot to kind of clean up some of the fraudulent and abusive practices in the systems, including some closed school discharges, and billions of dollars have been really invested in sort of given back to help remedy some of the wrongs that our regulatory environment has allowed to happen for a long time.
I think it's important to emphasize that point about what the Biden administration has been able to do internally. I don't have the data in front of me, sadly. Unlike Nick, who was very well prepared. But the public student loan forgiveness program, it's been around for a long time, but it was almost impossible to get your loans forgiven. They forgave trivial percent of applications, and they have really fixed that program and are making it easier for people to claim what they're legally entitled to. So yeah, and then with the restart of repayment, there are waivers, there are deferrals that people can apply for if you're unemployed, if you have other forms of economic hardship or health-related issues. There's a whole system in place to defer your loans. It's just if you're slated to start paying loans, it's going to be hard to get your loan servicer on the phone. So you should probably start trying now, and make a plan for when you have to start paying.
So when we think about, we can all speculate what the outcome of this case might be, but overall, it isn't going to solve the problem of the high cost of higher education in this country. It's not going to solve the problem of student debt and overall debt that students incur for their educations. How do we solve this problem? Where do we start?
Yeah, I was scrolling through the questions. There are some great questions out there, which we want to have time to do that. Martha and I have worked for years on this issue of local and state-based tuition-free college programs, which are spreading and continue to spread around the country. They are partial and very localized solutions to the problem of college affordability. I don't have a good answer. I'm about to hand off to my co-panelists, but I just want to say a little bit of context. We really have a huge problem on our hands around college affordability, and it's something that's accumulated over decades and is not going to be able to be resolved like this. Higher education, less so community college, but especially four-year degrees, have really become unaffordable for middle-class students. And that's partly because of these relentless tuition increases, which are the product of mainly state cutbacks in funding for higher ed, and the assumption that universities and colleges will be able to balance their budgets essentially on the back of students through tuition. And the fact that Pell Grants, that the main vehicle for federal student aid for low-income students, has just failed to keep up with rising tuition costs. And middle-income families don't even have access to those. So we've also got, we've got a real crisis of higher ed on our hands. We also have demographic trends that are leading to a shrinking college-age population. We have a political debate over the value of college that's highly politicized and a product of our current era of polarization that I've never witnessed before and is very strange to me. And we have a strong labor market right now too, although that may not last, but all of those things are putting pressure on colleges and universities. The competition for students is really, really intense. And the pain of all of these issues fall, as it often does, most heavily on the least advantaged students, first-generation college goers, low-income students, racially minoritized students who are maybe thinking about college for the first time. So I'd say the situation is pretty urgent. And with that, I will punt to Martha and Nick for ideas on how to fix it.
Yeah, well,
You have 10 minutes to solve this.
Yeah, no, I'll say that I served for over a year on the I want to underscore this, bipartisan policy committee to look at college affordability. And we had equal number of parties represented, as the individuals on this committee, from mayors to governors to so forth. And one of the very interesting things to me was that they had supported what Bobby Scott from Congress suggested a long time ago, which was a tuition program that would be a federal state matching grant. And it would be an opt-in, so states could decide whether it was worth doing so. But local communities and the states cannot do this alone. It was very obvious to me that federal support ultimately is needed. As Michelle said, about the Pell Grant, it used to pay 75 to 80% of a student's college costs. Now it's below 30%. So the Pell Grant, even doubling, will not cover the full cost of college for every student in the country. So I think, with some of the constraints that were put into the agreement from the Bipartisan Policy Committee, it would be advantageous for the federal government to come in with a match to states. And this particular policy recommended that states pay $1 for every $3 to $4 that the federal government would put in. But it would really be a tremendous solution for the continuing problems that we're going to have with or without the Supreme Court decision. So I just wanted to cover that. And, making tuition free for community colleges and ultimately for four-year schools are going to give the students the opportunity to finish, not to drop out because of college costs. So we have, hundreds of communities that are trying to do something. About more than half the states also have added to state aid and with special conditions. So I think, local communities and states are trying to do all they can with that, but without the federal government taking some kind of leadership in this, it's going to continue to be difficult.
I would add that I agree with all of the statements, and in my mind, I'm thinking those examples are great examples of how to prevent future students from falling into this river of debt, and then for those who are in the river and struggling to swim, how do we get them out, and how do we help resolve it on the back end? And so I would just add, there's some promising ideas, and who knows where this will go on the sort of the downstream effects of loan debt. But I think a lot of the improvements to the repayment system that we've seen over the last couple of years, the efforts that are being made are promising. But I think we have a pretty brutal repayment system. Some would say even inhumane repayment system, where if you fall behind on your student loan, you're not going to get that discharged in bankruptcy typically. And also the federal government will and has the authority to garnish your wages, hold back Social Security benefits, prevent you from taking on more student aid, a number of different things that might want to be reconsidered. And we might find some new ways to think about how the loan system and the loan repayment system could be updated, modernized for 21st century, because it's very draconian in a lot of ways.
Sorry. Well, Michelle, you're muted. You go ahead.
All right. That's a really important point, Nick, that you just made, that previous student loan debt is a barrier for returning to college for many students who maybe took on debt, went to college for a while, didn't complete degrees, but are maybe now in a position where they can, and you're not allowed to get any additional debt if you're holding debt. And so there are some pilot programs around the country that work. Some of these debt amounts are really small. They might involve non-payment of parking fee or some sort of college fee, and you can't re-enroll without addressing that. So there's some pilots to try to think about new ways of doing that. But I think you're right. We have this system that it's incredibly punitive, and it's also really complex. And as Martha well knows, this work that we've all done on tuition-free college, one of the really wonderful things about what we call the Promise movement is that there's an emphasis on simplicity, on sending a very clear message about college affordability. You can do that if you've created some tuition-free pathway. If you're graduating from high school in Tennessee, you almost certainly know now that you can go to the community college tuition-free. And that just takes away a huge amount of this process that you have to deal with. And so I think there's some promise to these promise programs. Sorry, it's the inevitable promise pun, but they're not at scale. And of course, there was an effort by the Biden administration to take them to scale as part of the Build Back Better bill that did not progress. I don't think federal level tuition-free college is, totally off the table forever, but I don't think we should hold our breath for it at the moment. Martha knows better than I do.
Yeah, I agree. I think we are just too polarized to even consider a realistic approach to this. And, kudos to the communities and states that are doing all they can, because it's a really difficult, and they're faced with all these students who are burdened by their debts. And, they're trying to do what they can to provide relief and also provide some of the wraparound supports that Nick mentioned, the full college costs, transportation, food, other things that, especially low-income students, first-generation students may be lacking in, the quality of life that they deserve to live.
Someone in the comments mentioned the Paycheck Protection Program, and I feel that person's pain. We can do things that are generous, simple, accommodating, in a societal interest. And that Paycheck Protection Program, it was easy to get those loans. And yes, there was some abuse in the system, there was some fraud in the system, but that was considered the price you pay to, accomplish this social purpose. And for some reason, there's just this huge double standard when it comes to the social value of having a population that is trained and educated. And it's probably a good time to throw in that when we talk about college, I think everybody here knows this, we're not talking about just four-year academic degrees. We're talking about any kind of post-secondary education or training offered by post-secondary institutions, some of it very short-term, most of which helps you get a better job and helps you be a better citizen. So we have to be careful to make sure that we talk about college broadly, because a lot of the debates that happen around debt relief are like, well, someone went off and got a degree in, music education. And, yes, true, but other people went off and got degrees in welding and borrowed for that. And so, it's a very broad term, and we have to remember to reiterate that.
Yeah, and I think Nick's point, Nick, you've said a couple of times some of these non-tuition expenses, including room and board. That's a huge cost, but also childcare is a huge issue for students who would like to go to college but can't afford childcare to do it. And kudos to places. I think that it's in my home state of Connecticut, but I think it's Central Connecticut State, which offers free childcare to any student attending. Like, those are amazing programs.
I just add also that there was just a study done and an opportunity for colleges and universities to actually partner with Head Start. And there are lots of ways to cover the cost. So there are solutions to some of the college costs beyond tuition and fees, but with a state-federal partnership, that would optimize the student opportunity on the financial side. Absolutely.
Well, I know we are at it's 3:45, and it looks like we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. Should we turn to answering some of those? Does that sound good to you all?
Sure.
I am going to just okay, here's a good question. Didn't the student borrowers voluntarily enter into contractual repayment terms? What about the moral hazard of forgiving loans?
I'll try to fumble over this response. I think it's a fair question, and I hear that question a lot. I think one way to complicate that question, though, is this. I think of this as like a debt trap, and not to be like overly hyperbole about it, but like, you're told, go to college to make your life better. Go to college, take on that debt, and sign whatever you have to sign, because the college education is going to pay off sometime in your future. And when you leave college, you're pretty much often at the lowest earning potential in your career. It's going to take several years for especially a new college graduate to get to their maximum earning potential. And so we actually are repaying our loans at the sort of worst time in the life course, when people are at their most vulnerable economically. And there's also a lot of uncertainty and risk in knowing, well, what am I going to study? Am I even going to finish this degree? I don't know, but it's a risk I'm willing to take. And so, yes, the question, I think maybe the word that stood out to me is they voluntarily entered into this contractual agreement. And there's a lot of trade-offs that go into that. And so I think that helps me kind of soften my thinking around the sort of responsibility versus the rights and balancing those out. It's hard, but I think that's how I would answer it.
I think that's a good way to think about it. But I do think that it's a fair question. And I think the fact that this is kind of a one-time, albeit big, important, affects many people. And I don't know if the Supreme Court is going to take this on or not, if it's something that they're attuned to or interested in. But, you know, if the student loan debt relief goes ahead, does it set a precedent for 3 years from now, we do it again? What about the people who were not subject to the student loan relief package, but are now accumulating student loan debt? Does it create kind of this precedent? We patch the system up all the time here and there. We try to patch it up. And it really needs to be kind of wholesalely rethought. It's very, very hard to do. And there's no political will for it. And as we know, we're in a very polarized time. But I think that raises a really interesting question. I don't know if it's a legal question, but it's certainly kind of a political question.
There's another question here about, or a comment saying, you know, the government bailed out banks, they bail out automobile companies. Why is this not the same?
It's a great question. I think that is what the government is currently doing, subsidizing different parts of the economy. And, you know, agriculture comes to mind, having subsidized farming for decades. And I think when it comes to students themselves, there's sort of a pit against, they did it and they need to earn it. And it's sort of like up to them and up to their families, the me first kind of thing, versus, you know, do we have responsibility to the entire country to help, you know, millions and millions, as I said, you know, 43 million would qualify for the debt relief. You know, what is our moral and ethical and financial responsibility to find a way to subsidize these students who most need the help, who will drive back into the economy with taxes and, you know, all kinds of ways that the economy will benefit much less, you know, as Michelle mentioned, you know, quality of life and living in this country. And there'll be less subsidies on other parts with a more educated country. So, for example, people don't often say this, but, you know, Medicare healthcare in general declines as students are more able to, you know, pay for their lives and get a good education. Not Medicare, I don't mean that, but, you know, healthcare subsidies will be reduced. So other parts of the way we subsidize individuals and companies and workers, you know, need to be thought through, because those would be real savings, much less, you know, paying into the tax base of the country.
I might be the only political scientist here, but I think the answer to the question is why do we do farm subsidies and not student loan debt relief? It's a political answer, and it has to do with political power and organization and the claim on Congress's attention and the priority that certain different populations receive. So I think that you know, there has been the birth of a student organizing movement that has been very vocal, but students are, like Nick said, they're just getting out of school with or without degrees. They're working hard. They're generally fairly poor. They don't really have the capacity, the money, the organization, the time, the energy to be like a real serious lobby. If you think about like the elderly population in the early 60s, seniors who got themselves organized and created lobby groups that became powerful and advocated for legislation that would help them, and they became less poor as a result of that, as a result of Medicare and the indexing of Social Security, you could see something similar happening, except that older people have more time. So to do that organizing. And so I think, thinking in terms a little bit in terms of political power is important.
I'm going to throw another question out there. I'm trying to hit questions that get at very different angles at the issue we're discussing, but another attendee has asked, can you address why the costs of college are growing with few constraints? And could we, I think what is implied in this comment is, could we help address the issue if we can control the costs of college rather than funding for it?
I mean, I would just reference people over to the state higher education executive officers. They publish a wonderful report, SHEO, it's sheo.org. They publish a report, and you can see very easily from the charts over time that states have reduced the funding for higher education significantly, and in some states hardly at all. I mean, 5% or less. And so what's happened is tuition has risen to fill that gap and to also, maintain, academic excellence and, providing students with the best education that's possible. So college costs have risen predominantly because states have reduced their contribution to the college costs.
I could give I agree with all that. I could give a different angle on it too. It's really interesting. And this is one that I still am trying to understand better, but it's called the cost disease. And it's a more of an economic rationale, but basically colleges are in the business of employing a lot of highly educated people, and they have faculty members and administrators and staff that are expensive to pay for if you want them to work at your university, because they can go and work in the private sector. So you have to have competitive wages and pay benefits, health benefits, and so forth, that sometimes are outside of the control of the college themselves. But if a college wants to compete for human resources, it's an expensive game to play. And that game, we see it across the board with all sorts of professional services, whether it's doctors or lawyers or physicians, whatever, and faculty members and university personnel. It's a labor-intensive enterprise. That's where a lot of the money is, and it's not going to go down.
Yeah, there's a lot of comments in here too about the holders of the loans or the service providers on the loans, and terms of loans and repayment changing without the person who's receiving the loan really knowing or understanding what's happening. And how is that allowed to happen? Is that something that are there moves towards regulating the way those loans are managed so that there aren't these crazy unforeseen changes to the loans? Is that something that you can comment on at all? I know none of us are loan officers or
I don't really know enough about it. And I think, it's important to note that there's a whole private loan industry outside of this direct loan industry that we're talking about. And so the federal government has very little leverage over private loan services, so servicers. But yeah, I mean, the system is so complex and opaque. I just feel terrible for anybody who has to go out at this point and figure out what kind of loan to get and how to get it. They don't do it this way in other countries. I will say that. Jess, we can't hear you. You're breaking up a little bit.
No, can't hear me.
Now we can.
Oh, good. Okay. Sorry, I have no idea why I'm having these technical issues, but I was trying, where I was going was, can you talk about other countries and their models for providing much less expensive educations, higher educations for their populations, or even free education? How do they do it?
I definitely don't want to make the case that other countries are paragons, because they have been, college has been more affordable, but for fewer people. The US has a very democratized, accessible system of higher education. In our peer democracies, it's more rationed. But when I said they don't do it like that in other countries, we have this sort of uniquely market-driven, let 1,000 flowers bloom, whoever wants to be a loan servicer can be. That might not be technically true, but it's very privatized, market-oriented system. It would, in my opinion, it would make more sense for the federal government to lend people money for college, because it is a public good. It's good for society. It's good for the economy. And then people would pay the federal government back. So we instead create a whole bunch of private intermediaries, which adds tremendous complexity to the system. I really don't want us to emulate, Germany or the UK, where you get tracked quite early on. And if your trajectory changes over time and all of a sudden you become college material, you want to go to college, you want to get a degree or certificate or credential, you can't. I don't want us to lose that openness of our system. That's the 2-minute version of other countries.
I'm almost going to bring it back full circle to the history part. Before the 1965 Higher Education Act, there were some big debates in America about how to structure a financing system, and the debates that we heard then, or that I've read about that from then, are very similar to today. And one of the ideas out there that some countries have pursued is to basically have students pay a portion of their future earnings back to some sort of education bank or something like that. We might call it a graduate tax. Or have the central government play a strong role in making sure that those payments get returned through the tax system or through wage withholding. That was an idea back, in the 50s and 60s. Milton Friedman pushed it. And today, some of the solutions that I hear most oftentimes talk about are very similar to those same ideas about some sort of income-driven repayment plans that are sensitive to monthly earnings tied to your taxes and your weekly incomes.
Well, I think we probably, in the interest of time, we should probably not pull any more questions from the chat, but this has been a wonderful discussion. I think we are all really eager to see where the Supreme Court comes down. Hopefully we'll know in another couple of weeks, but we all need to be working on solving this problem of the cost of higher education, and you've given us so much to think about. Thank you so much for serving on our panel and having this discussion. And thanks to everybody who's watching for attending. You will get a follow-up email with more information from us. And thank you to Jasbal at the Graduate School of Education IT department for being on emergency backup for us. But thank you all so much for being here. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who listened. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.